Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's Karl Brunner lecture organized by the Swiss National Bank. It's so good to see you all here at ETH Zurich. And we also have people joining this event via the live stream, so hello and welcome to all of you as well. My name is Tanja König, and it's my great pleasure to guide you through tonight's public lecture. And like every year, you will hear from a leading economist. This year, it's someone who will share a different perspective on inflation. But before we hear from our guest speaker, we'd like to welcome the location host, the president of ETH Zurich, here onto the floor for some opening remarks. So please welcome Joël Mesot.
Thank you, Tanja. Dear President of the Swiss National Bank, dear Martin, esteemed guest speaker, John Cochrane, ladies and gentlemen here and on the video, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all at this year's Karl Brunner Distinguished Lecture here at ETH Zurich. I just discussed first, if I may, with John, and it's the first time he's here at ETH Zurich. Turns out I'm just coming back from Asia, and ETH is not well known everywhere, so I have a simple way to put it. I say ETH is the least known top 10 university of the world. If they don't get it, then I say this is where Einstein studied, and then usually that works. So the Swiss National Bank and ETH Zurich share many parallels, as well as a long-standing tradition of collaboration. But let me just highlight two similarities. Both institutions have a national mandate and serve the public good of Switzerland. And moreover, the SNB, independence, and ETH Zurich autonomy are key pillars of our respective successes. When I speak of ETH Zurich, service to society, I'm thinking of the many global challenges ahead of us that need answers now and not in 20 years. Just one example, the impact of war and geopolitical conflicts that has an impact on millions of people around the world. And science is not the only voice in addressing these challenges, but it is a vital one. And especially when it comes to developing solutions for a more prosperous, sustainable, and fair world. ETH Zurich has been contributing to this mission over more than 170 years. And we do that in three ways. We educate young people, so 70% of our students go directly to economy. We are advancing the frontiers of knowledge through research, and we combine education and research together, and we transfer the knowledge to society, to industry and society. Today, we create about 30 new ETH spin-off companies every year, between 30 and 40. Maybe what's more interesting, in the last 2 years, there were more than about 2 billion in venture capital flowing in ETH startups. I think that's, when we compare with US universities, that puts a little bit ETH on the map. However, education, research, and technology transfer alone are not longer enough to make a meaningful impact. Increasingly, the dialogue with the key societal stakeholders is essential. I am president since 7 years. We have been going through crisis to crisis. I mean, COVID in the second year of my presidency, and we have learned the hard way how it is difficult in times of crisis to establish this dialogue at the political level, at the administrative level, at the societal levels. So in French, we see we don't want to have a dialogue de sourds, and we want not to be in a conversation between the deaf. ETH Zurich has intensified its efforts in recent years to promote such dialogues, both nationally and internationally. And together, just to give you a few examples, with our sister institution, EPFL, we have launched a collaboration with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, under the banner of Engineering Humanitarian Action. That was done 5 or 6 years ago, and we see how important this is now to be in the refugees camps. 2 years ago, we entered a new strategic partnership with the United Nations, and in the coming weeks, we will announce a new initiative that aimed at strengthening the interaction between science and policy. Always with some technological focus, of course. That will be something ETH special. So we live in times of uncertainty, and rule-based international relations are increasingly giving way to power politics. Finding orientation in such a context is becoming more difficult, especially in small countries like Switzerland. And furthermore, where disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence are transforming every aspect of our lives. I firmly believe that universities, as beacons of knowledge, have a vital role to play in helping society to navigate through this complex landscape of claims and counterclaims. Democracies depend on trustworthy sources to develop viable political solutions. Likewise, the economy and society need credible institutions to make evidence-based decisions. And this certainly includes far-reaching monetary and interest rate decisions by central banks, as well as macroeconomic assessments of a country's situation. I'm therefore very much looking forward to our guest speaker, John Cochrane, from Stanford University, and his insights into the role of fiscal policy in shaping inflation. Thank you all for being here. I wish you an inspiring and thought-provoking evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joël Mesot, also to ETH Zurich for your valuable work you do for society, as you just explained. Now I'd like to hand over to the host of tonight, who, by the way, just celebrated his first year in the position as chairman of the governing board of the SMB just yesterday. So please welcome Martin Schlegel.
So, dear State Secretary Stoffel, dear President of the Bank Council, Barbara Janum-Steiner, dear Chair Amstad, President Mesot, and dear Professor Cochrane. Ladies and gentlemen, this lecture is a tribute to the legacy of Karl Brunner. Karl Brunner is a leading figure in monetarism. He had a profound impact on the Swiss National Bank's monetary policy approach in the 1970s and in the 1980s. But Brunner also had critical views on central banks. Central banks relied too much on judgment, he believed. Brunner preferred rules. This he has in common with our today's speaker. Our speaker also tends to prefer rules over discretion. But before I introduce him, let me first thank Joël Mesot for hosting us here at the ETH Zurich. It's always a pleasure to be here at ETH Zurich, so thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now introduce our speaker today, John Cochrane. John is a renowned professor of finance and economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. His background is as fascinating as it is impressive. In his blog, he calls himself the grumpy economist. Apparently, his kids called him like that after a rant at the dinner table. But I can assure you, he's a pleasure to talk to, which I've just experienced firsthand. John's career path was not always straightforward. He started his academic journey with a bachelor's degree in physics at MIT before deciding to study economics. He's in good company. Other notable figures like Bertrand Russell and Max Planck also ventured into economics after starting their careers in the exact sciences. Planck is said to have dropped economics because he found it too difficult. And Russell is said to have dropped it because he found it too easy. I don't know whether John finds economics difficult or easy, but I'm glad that he went on to pursue a PhD in economics rather than physics. But where? John called up a few places, and two accepted him, Berkeley and Chicago. And he chose Berkeley for a very simple reason: it doesn't snow there. After earning his PhD, John moved to Chicago. He appreciated the intellectual environment and the tough but honest debates there. For more than 2 decades, he was a professor at Chicago's Booth School of Business before joining Stanford. John is a prolific writer. His works span many branches of economics: financial economics, macroeconomics, and of course, monetary policy. His research has been very influential, and his ideas continue to shape the field. But one thing really sets him apart. John has often surprising insights that go against the consensus. I would like to briefly touch upon 3 of these insights. I have picked those 3 because they are particularly thought-provoking from the point of view of a central bank. The first is about financial regulation. John argues that regulators should not rely on what he calls long, vague, and complex rules. For him, such rules are basically the same like discretion. Instead, regulators should focus on one thing. They should make sure that financial institutions have enough capital. The exact definition of enough is right now hotly debated in Switzerland, as you know. The second insight is about the link between inflation and interest rates. Normally, central bank thinks, if we raise interest rates, inflation will go down. John brought the opposite effect into mainstream macroeconomic models. The Neo-Fisher effect says that high interest rates might actually lead to high inflation. Why? Because when people see high rates, they might expect high inflation in the future. The third insight is about the link between inflation and fiscal policy. His book, The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, says that in the end, inflation is determined by fiscal policy. Unbacked increases in fiscal spending translate into inflation. In Switzerland, we enjoy both low public debt and also low inflation. That would seem to support John's theory. Today, John will present his thoughts on inflation. I am honored that John joined us in Switzerland, and I'm sure that you will enjoy his lecture. So please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I'm done. You've presented my entire research career. It is a particular honor to be here for many reasons. One is, of course, the memory of Karl Brunner. I read his papers as a graduate student and remember them to this day, so that also rings true. I decided to try to, tonight, to encapsulate 30 years of thinking about inflation into 45 minutes with not too many equations. So good luck to me, but we'll talk about the other things later. Inflation is very interesting. We are right now at a wonderful moment, I think, There is a policy doctrine of how central banks work that has been around for 40, 50 years. There is economic theory, and there is an unrecognized but immense chasm between these two. It is time to bring them together. You might say, well, that's just the lessons of experience. If theorists are off in the crazy stuff, who cares? But theory matters to experience. I just learned that the Romans learned through experience to dip their instruments in boiling water before operating on people. They learned that through experience. They didn't know why. But of course, on the other hand, doctors used to bleed people when they were sick. They learned that through experience too. How do you know whether your experience is boiling in surgical instruments or bleeding patients? It takes theory. Until you know how it works in theory, you don't really know how it works in experience. So we need to bring these two together. And it's an exciting moment. We are making progress, but I'll show you where you have a long way to go. So I'm going to talk about inflation. My other warning is I'm not going to say anything about Switzerland, which is I'm trying to be polite, not rude. I hate Americans who wander around the world and tell countries how they should do their own things. But you can, I hope the general principles will apply, and I think they do. A lot of your success in containing inflation has to do with solid fiscal backing. So let's get to work. Let's just start in with what happened recently, which I think introduces the topic. And again, my slides will be US. Europe is the same. UK and Japan, very similar. Switzerland not, but good for you. So what happened was there was the pandemic, of course, a little bit of lower inflation. Suddenly in January 2021, inflation came out of nowhere, and central banks hadn't done much of anything unusual, so it seemed to come out of nowhere. Inflation then got very strong, while central banks did pretty much nothing for a whole year. Now, normal doctrine says inflation does not go away unless central banks raise interest rates sharply and cause a Great Depression, a Great Recession like 1980. But no, inflation plateaued and then started to ease all on its own. Finally, central banks raised interest rates, and here we are. Inflation came down quite quickly, but is surprisingly persistent. Are we on a glide path or about to stall 50 feet off the runway? We'll find out. So where did inflation come from? Why did it plateau and ease? Well, perhaps coincidentally, but I think the elephant in the room here is, of course, the enormous fiscal stimuluses of the pandemic. I've graphed here US debt as a way of tracking it. During the pandemic, the US borrowed $5 trillion, monetized $3 trillion of it, so essentially printed $3 trillion, handed it out. Borrowed $2 trillion more, handed that out as checks to people and businesses. I do not want necessarily to criticize that here. That's just what they did. We had to do something. There was a pandemic on. But that's what they did. Importantly for the story, the move to huge deficits and spending continued even after COVID ended. I put my book, Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, there because that's when I turned the manuscript into the publisher with a introduction that said, we haven't seen inflation for 40 years, so you'll never sell any of these. Fortunately, I got to change that introduction, because it also said, don't print up $5 trillion of money and hand it out. You'll get inflation. So clearly, this fast fiscal expansion is an elephant in the room of what caused inflation. This is another graph, just to emphasize how enormous it was, the big spurt during COVID, and then the second spurt after COVID was over. This is the deficit or surplus. And reminding you, it was a one-time shock. The US is back to normal levels of dysfunction. It would be better if it were higher, but if things were okay back then, they're back to where they were with a worrying future, but we didn't continue that level. It was a one-time shock. This graph from Bob Barrow and Francesco Bianchi is on the x-axis, how much government spent during COVID, on the y-axis, how much inflation they got. And you can see this pattern is common across countries. It is not my fault that Switzerland isn't on here. We're called Barrow and Bianchi to complain. Or is it? Sorry, I didn't look at them. Oh, I thought it was, okay, so CH is what I was looking for. But okay, so now we can't just tell stories. So let's try to think about how does debt and deficits matter, because it doesn't always matter. So here I'll introduce the concept of fiscal theory of the price level. which says, where does inflation come from? That's a big puzzle. Why do we work so hard for these pieces of paper? That's what motivated me to start thinking about this many years ago. Well, the fiscal theory of the price level says, fundamentally, we apply prices present value of dividends to the government. That the real value of nominal debt must be the present value of the primary surpluses that repay that debt. And if people wake up and say, you know, I don't trust the government to repay that debt, what do? They try to get rid of it. And by trying to, the only way we can collectively get rid of debt is by trying to buy things, driving up the price of goods and services. Taxes soak up money. Taxes overspending. If there isn't enough taxes overspending to soak up the money, it chases goods and services and causes inflation. Now this perspective, this asset pricing perspective, you can see I used to be a finance professor. I learned that price is present value of dividends, and then like a 2-year-old with a hammer, I go around looking for nails. Everything looks like a nail, including government debt, but it works. That's the central idea. Once you think a little more analytically, you realize debt and deficits are not necessarily inflationary. It matters about expected repayment. So in the first graph, I showed how it's supposed to work. You borrow in a crisis, in a war. You pay it off later. Everybody understands that. They're willing to lend the government money and hold it as savings. There's no change in the present value. The negatives match the positives, and there is no inflation. Government debt, well managed, is a good and great thing. It allows governments to meet a temporary emergency and spread the taxes to pay for it over a generation. In that case, debt and deficit, no inflation. And that's what we could and should see most of the time. The danger is the second graph, a debt and deficit that is not convincingly backed by plans to repay it. That's what causes inflation. And of course, the last danger, people lose faith. Inflation seems to come out of nowhere, as it often does. Focus then not just on debt and deficits, but on the institutions, on, for example, the debt rules, good on you, Switzerland, that guarantee repayment. That's what allows debt and deficits not to be inflationary. With that in mind, let's look back at the episode. Aha, we can't just look at debt and deficits. Why did people not expect it to be repaid? Now, I'll be brief, but if you look at the history as I have, it's quite plausible that in this episode in the US, in Europe, less so in Switzerland, people did not trust the repayment. We suspended our spending rules. Our Treasury Secretary said, don't worry about repaying the debt. Interest costs are low. R less than G, modern monetary economics, all of that was in the air. Everybody thought for 10 years, don't worry about government debt. You never have to repay government debt. And so those promises didn't exist. Now, this isn't how we do economics. I've told stories. I hope you think it's a plausible story. But economics is about models. Now, having equations does not mean you're right. But if you can't write down the equations, you're almost certainly wrong. And so let me show you how I approach that. We need a theory of monetary policy. Whoops, excuse me. And this is a simple one. So I'm going to write down 2 simple equations. There's also 2 simple ideas. The first idea, we need central banks. So what do central banks do? They set interest rates. If prices are flexible, what I'm starting with here, higher interest rates means higher future inflation. That's what happens, that's what happens when prices are flexible. We all understand 100% inflation, 100% interest rates, 0 inflation, 0 interest rates. That's when you get to the flexible price point, that's how it works. Second, of course, is our friend the fiscal theory, that the real value of nominal debt is the present value of surpluses, which means that if there's bad news to the surplus on the right-hand side, that must show up on inflation on the left-hand side. So we have a complete theory of inflation under interest rate targets, which is our big challenge. Well, the interest rate target sets expected inflation, fiscal policy sets unexpected inflation, and now we know where inflation comes from. That's a nice theory. Is it a good theory? Well, it's not a realistic theory the way we have it. Higher interest rates raise inflation? What are you talking about? Well, that's flexible prices. So, of course, we have to put sticky prices in and see if that changes things. So let's add sticky prices, and here I go. I grayed out the equations so as not to scare everybody, most people of the audience, but I left them there because the economists in the audience will go, what are you talking about if I can't show you what it is? That just means there are equations, and what I'm showing you is a simulation from a very simple model. This is standard textbook model that's been in every textbook for 30 years. What happens with a little bit of price stickiness if you dump money on people with no plan to repay that money? What happens is you get a surge of inflation. That's the pie, the red line. Inflation always in red. I don't like inflation. The price level starts rising slowly and eventually goes up. In this simulation, the central bank does nothing because I'm trying to see just what's the effect of fiscal policy, and that's also what happened in the event. So here it is. It's a textbook model. It's the standard model with a little fiscal theory in it. What happens if you dump $5 trillion of debt with no plans to repayment? You get a surge of inflation coming seemingly out of nowhere. It then goes away on its own without central banks having to do anything. The central economics here is if the government spends money, does not tax to get the money, either current taxpayers or future taxpayers, someone's got to pay. Who pays? Bondholders. We inflate away the value of their bond holdings to pay for the transfers of COVID. And that's pretty much what happened. Now, central banks matter. Here's the same set of equations. What happens if the central bank raises interest rates? Again, I'm wrestling with this prediction. Higher interest rates raise inflation. That's just screaming at you from theory. Here's a modification that helps to get around. And that's how we do it in economics. We start simple, and then we add other ingredients as needed. Keep the soup as simple as possible. Don't just throw everything in, but add ingredients as you need until it tastes good. So here, if the central bank raises interest rates and there is no change in fiscal policy, inflation does go down, although eventually it goes up in the long run. Nobody really sees the long run, so this is an insight from theory, but at least we've delayed it. This is a good and great thing for central banks to do. If you're a central bank and this hits you, there's a surge of inflation that goes away. That's bad for the economy. If you add this to it, if you respond to inflation with higher interest rates, you'll bring down that surge of inflation initially, although at the cost of a long, persistent inflation. And that is a good thing to do. Yes, central banks should raise interest rates in response to inflation. The Taylor rule is always the answer. It's just the questions that keep changing. In this case, that is praise, not criticism. So where are we? We have an event. Inflation came, peaked before central banks did much, went away quickly, and is now persistent. We have a theory. The fiscal shock, inflation surges out of nowhere. Monetary policy, when it wakes up and responds, can bring it down quickly at the cost of substantial inflation. That's how we do things. I think that adds to the persuasiveness of the story that an actual model produces it. This is not necessarily bad, and it's not necessarily new. In every war for centuries, governments have responded to the war and the crisis by borrowing a lot of money, but then printing a lot of money too, trying to hold down interest costs on the debt with low interest rates, and eventually they move into price controls. Inflation pays for once-in-a-generation shocks. Whether this was a once-in-a-generation shock with inflation, we can argue about some other day, but this is just war finance. Inflation, by the way, has many lessons for policy beyond inflation. The 2010s were a decade of secular stagnation, insufficient demand, modern monetary theory. The key to growth and prosperity is if only governments would borrow more money and print more money and hand it out, and we would all become rich again. That was the zeitgeist of 2010 to 2020. Well, we did what you asked for, and we got inflation out of it. The lesson is that if you want to grow, it has to come from supply. We have supply-constrained economies, not demand-deficient economies. Supply is easier in some sense and much harder politically than just handing money out. And that's a deep lesson that policy needs to start paying attention to. Next topic. Well, I've shown you one theory of inflation. How about the others? I will now show you a list of the theories of inflation, all known theories of inflation. And I will try to persuade you that the combination of current new Keynesian economics plus fiscal theory is the only known complete economic theory of inflation under interest rate targets consistent with current institutions. So there's no point in testing. It's the only one we've got. We'll see if I can persuade you. I'll also try to persuade you, maybe more persuasively, that recent history provides a clean set of experiments that distinguishes the known theory of inflation. How are we going to do that? Well, let's look at the theories. First of all, let's talk to some central banks, less transparent ones than here, who blame it on supply shocks or relative demand shocks. Shocks hit us. It wasn't our fault. When you think of it, that's a remarkable admission, because that says the next time shocks hit, inflation will come and there's nothing we can do about it again. Usually central banks like to pretend they're more in charge. Politicians, of course, went for greed, monopoly, price gouging, hoarders, speculators, and all the usual suspects, as they have since the time of Emperor Diocletian, who blamed exactly those things for his inflation in 300 AD to no more success than current ones. What's wrong with this? There is a classic mistake in all of this, which I bring it up because you hear it in the newspapers all the time. Each of these forces is a relative price shock. In the pandemic, there were supply shocks. You couldn't make Pelotons. There was demand shocks. Everybody wanted a Peloton. So the price of Pelotons should go up relative to restaurant dinners and relative to wages. But why does that make everything go up? How did we get the extra money to pay the higher prices for the Pelotons and the higher prices for everything else? Aha, we got it from the government. You only get overall inflation if the government accommodates a shock by giving us the money. Overall inflation is always demand about where everything is. Relative price shocks are one thing versus another. And the most common mistake is to think about the overall level as simply the sum of relative price changes. That's not how it works. Now, what did happen is that the supply shocks hit, our governments responded by boosting demand, just as they did in the 1970s for the oil price shocks, because they thought it was better for everything to go up than for one to go up and others to go down. That, they think, causes more economic disruption. So what happened is, yes, there was a shock. The ultimate shock was the lab leak or COVID. That caused supply shocks. The supply shocks caused policy that's the horse that pulls the cart. Inflation is always a choice. It doesn't come to hit us, and it is a choice of how much demand fiscal and monetary policy provide. How about money? Here's MV equals PY, the other great theory. There's Milton Friedman, whose California license plate said MV equals PY. Regularly, apparently, the Highway Patrol made him pull off the equal. He paid the ticket and just put it right back on again. Of course, Karl Brunner, our distinguished host here, was famous for monetarism and the helicopters. So this is a wonderful theory. It makes total sense as theory. But as a theoretical objection, it does not work in today's institutions because it requires that central banks control the money supply. They don't, they target interest rates. And the theory just does not, it's a theory of how much money people hold, not a theory of prices, when central banks provide people all the money they want at the given interest rate. So facts, how do we distinguish it? Well, fiscal theory and monetarism agree. Money is just a form of government debt to fiscal theory, so we agree. Drop money or government debt from helicopters, you get inflation. What do we disagree about? A central tenet of monetarism is that if the central bank gives you $5 trillion of money, but takes back $5 trillion of treasury debt, that has exactly the same effects as just giving you the money, right? Because the money supply increased. Fiscal theory says absolutely not. If I take one and give you another, that's less like giving you $20 bills and taking back 2 5s and a 10 for each one. No effect. That doesn't make you go out and spend. Wouldn't it be lovely if our government would run an experiment to tell the difference? They just did. In COVID, $5 trillion, that's financing a deficit. In quantitative easing, $5 trillion of money in return for $5 trillion of treasury bills. Here is the plot of the QE big expansions. There's the plot of inflation. Absolutely no effect on inflation. You cannot ask for a more ideal experiment to distinguish two theories. Now, the standard policy view is a view of interest rate targets. And the standard policy view is higher interest rates, lower demand, that lowers employment, and through the Phillips curve shock, that causes inflation. All kind of on a forward-looking basis. Economists in the audience, here's a simple set of equations to document the model and what I'm going to say about the model. Now, a central version of this theory, a central doctrine, is that inflation is inherently unstable. If inflation goes up with a constant interest rate, that's a lower real rate that raises demand and therefore raises future inflation. So inflation going up today means more inflation tomorrow. Inflation, if the interest rate is constant, is unstable, always threatening to spiral up or spiral down. What do central banks do about this? They raise interest rates when inflation goes up. They raise interest rates. The raising interest rates lowers future inflation and therefore stabilizes an unstable economy. The central bank is like the seal in the little drawing here. It's inherently unstable, but if the central bank moves his nose more than 1-for-1 with the movement of the ball will be stable. So higher interest rates lower future inflation. Central banks take an economy that's unstable and they make it stable. Hooray for central banks. Now, as a matter of theory, the problem with this is it requires that people mechanically look to the past for their expectations about the future. That's not a terrible assumption. That's nice icing on a cake. I have nothing against adaptive expectations. But as the only central, simplest model we have of the sign of monetary policy, it requires people being dumb. It requires the model's inconsistent. Anyone with knowledge of this model could outperform and make a ton of money on Wall Street. So, whereas fine for basics, we need a model where economics has something to say about inflation. Or we need to say there is no economics and it's all a conjuring trick. I think we'd all be unhappy with that. But let's not argue about theory. Let's look at facts. The central prediction. If the interest rate does not move, then inflation will always spiral up or spiral down out of control. The new Keynesian model, that was 1976. This is 1990. This is the model that pervades all of contemporary academic economics and the equations of central bank papers. The introductions, conclusions, and policy summaries tend to look like the other one, but this is what the equations actually do when you read them. And the difference is, for those of you following the equations, where there was a pi t minus 1, now there's a pi t plus 1. People think ahead when thinking of their expectations. Now this radically changes things. Now, if the central bank sets interest rates constant, inflation is stable. Inflation will eventually go away. And that actually is a very sensible property of an economy. Do we really think that a modern free market economy is inherently unstable, or do we think it's inherently stable? The properties of this model is it's inherently stable because if people are rational, it's like driving down the road. If you're adaptive and looking in the rearview mirror, you're going to steer off the road. If you're rational and looking forward, you're going to be stable. So rationality brings stability. The problem in this theory is we only have interest rate sets expected inflation, but unexpected inflation can be anything. So there are multiple equilibria and sunspots. The central problem of central banks is not instability, it's multiple equilibrium. Inflation jumps up and down. In this view of the world, when the central bank raises interest rates in response to inflation, which is, as I said, that's always the answer, just the questions keep changing. What does that do? What that does is illustrated in this graph here. It's stable, inflation will go away. Indeterminate, we don't know which one of those will happen. So the central bank takes a stable economy and deliberately makes it unstable and says, if you guys jump to any of these sunspots other than the one I like, I will induce a hyperinflation or hyperdeflation, and you will be unhappy about that, so everybody let's jump to where I like. If this sounds crazy, I'm sorry, but that's how the equations work. Now, central banks don't do that. My theoretical objection, this too, all these are beautifully, logically consistent theory. Central banks don't do that. I have a central bank, where are you? Do you worry about multiple equilibria and deliberately induce hyperinflationary, deflationary threats to make people jump to the equilibrium you like? Or do you view your job as, I stabilize the economy? I won't even let you answer because I know what the answer is. But let's not argue about theory. Let's look at facts. Central prediction here is if we leave interest rates alone, there will be sunspot volatility, and that will be bad. So what does fiscal theory do? It takes the same new Keynesian model, but in place of these off-equilibrium threats, only one of these equilibria, only one of these possibilities, is consistent with the fact that the real value of debt is the present value of surpluses. And the other ones, you can see the inflation jumps up or down. I said unexpected fiscal policy picks unexpected inflation. That solves the problem. So now we have, just admire the adjectives. Inflation is stable, that's pretty. It's determinate, there's only one answer. It's long-run neutral. As with monetary growth, higher money growth eventually is higher inflation. Here too, higher interest rates are eventually higher inflation. That makes sense in the long run once prices have gotten unsticky. So it's a beautiful, complete economic model of inflation under an interest rate target consistent with what we know central banks do. Prediction, what happens at a peg? Well, now we've lost the instability, we've lost the multiple equilibria. It is consistent with inflation just being very quiet at an interest rate peg. Experiment. Wouldn't it be nice if central banks would stop jiggering around interest rates, just leave them alone for like a decade, and let's see what happens? Wouldn't it be lovely if we could get them to do that? Of course, you know the joke, they just did. For 10 years, nobody knew what would happen, and there was a lot of justified worry. For 10 years, interest rates were stuck at zero, and inflation basically went nowhere. The scale of the graph is a little misleading. There's 1, 2, 3. It's batting around in the 2% range, as inflation always does. You can't ask for a clean air experiment. What if interest rates don't move? Old Keynesian view. Instability, deflation spiral, watch out. New Keynesian. Indeterminacy, multiple equilibria, back to the 1970s volatility, watch out. Fiscal theory, stable, determinate, and quiet, at least if there's no fiscal news. Fiscal policy wasn't great, but there wasn't any big shocks at the time like we saw later. Here's Europe, 14 years. Japan, 27. How long do you want to run this experiment before we declare what the answer is? Inflation just goes nowhere. This is big news. Inflation can be stable and quiet at a long-lasting peg. It's great news for us in the economy. Inflation can be stable and quiet with abundant reserves that pay market interest rates. The liquidity trap isn't a trap, it's a beautiful place. It's the Friedman rule. We can live the Friedman rule. This experiment and the theory really change our view of things. What about 1980s, you might say? That's the classic view of it's all monetary economics. Well, here's the picture which the young people in the audience should know about. Us old people remember it. There was a time of inflation that hit over 10% in the US. It was followed by very high interest rates. That's the red line, which through 2 bruising recessions brought down inflation. Wait, isn't that episode number 1 to convince you that monetary policy alone is what determines inflation? No, and the key is, wait a minute, interest rates are higher than inflation. The interest costs on the debt went way up. Who paid for that? Bondholders, I was in grad school. I wish I had bought bonds at 17.5% that paid off in a 2% inflation environment. I would have been living much, much wealthier if I had done so. A big transfer to bondholders. Who paid for that? Answer, fiscal policy. 1980s was a joint fiscal and monetary disinflation because what happened, we had a big fiscal reforms to Social Security. We had a huge tax reform. We had deregulation that set off economic growth. And in the next 10 years, the US moved to huge surpluses, not to perpetual deficits. That paid off the debt. It was a joint fiscal and monetary reform. Of course, I have lots of other episodes, which I won't tell you about tonight, but the best one of all, by Tom Sargent, is the end of the German hyperinflation after World War I. Notice the vertical axis, 10 to the 15th. There's a physicist in the room. In economics, we usually don't get to have vertical axes with 10 to the 15th on them. But there's a little bit of inflation. How did it end? The problem was Germany, under the Treaty of Versailles, could not pay its reparations, and it was running big deficits and printing money to cover the deficits. When it renegotiated the Treaty of Versailles and had a fiscal reform, people understood that the deficit would be under control in the future. Inflation stopped on a dime when that was passed. No high interest rates. Interest rates went down. No low money growth actually went up. Actually, short-term deficits went up. No recession, the economy boomed. Fix the fiscal problem, boom, you can fix the inflation. Finally, the big puzzle. Now this, I've told you what I know. Let me tell you about what I think we do not know. And this is where I hope to excite young people here. This is the moment for current research. We are at, I think it's like, you mentioned Einstein. It's like 1904 for physics. There's kind of everybody's sort of, oh, well, we understand how this works. There's a few little troubles that need to be reconciled, and then everything changes. Well, we are at a huge moment of experience and theory disagree with each other. The policy beliefs, I'll put it up there, higher interest rates, lower inflation on a forward-looking basis. The theory doesn't do anything like that. How do we fix the theory? Now, here's the fundamental. We start, inflation is stable, long-run neutral, meaning higher interest rates mean higher inflation. How are we going to make higher interest rates lead to low inflation? Well, stability and long-run neutrality are consistent with the long run it goes up, but you usually don't see the long run, so experience sees a short run when it goes down and then goes up in the long run. So we need a little more in the soup. You know, it's like the stone soup. We started with the stone, we put in a little bit of broth, now we need to put in some carrots, whatever it takes, to get to what I want is the simplest possible explainable to undergraduates theory that sort of matches reality. Eventually, maybe the policy view is wrong, but let's try to fix the theory first and see how much of experience we can get there. So here's our challenge. How do we get higher interest rates to lower inflation at all? And then how do we get them to lower inflation in the future rather than instantly? Now, this is about modifying the rest of the model. Fiscal theory is just one part of a model. I threw it into current New Keynesian models because that's what you got around. By the way, always change only one thing at a time, otherwise it all blows up. But now, how do we fix this? And the goal is something simple and explainable. There are models with 100 epicycles that get it right, but that no one believes that unless there's a simple explainable model of the basic sign of how monetary policy works. And let me just emphasize to you the fact that we don't have a model of the basic sign of monetary policy should be a little bit worrisome. Now, you might say, some of you in the audience know what do you mean? No textbook model with higher interest rates, lower inflation? What are you talking about? Read the textbook. Mike Woodford, Jordi Galli have excellent ones. Highly recommend them. This is the textbook New Keynesian model. There it is, grayed out. But just to remind the model lovers in the audience, this is just that system of equations, the IS curve, Phillips curve, and a Taylor rule. No fiscal theory funny business. And what does that model do? Well, in response to a monetary policy shock, that's the U, interest rates go up for a while, and that sends inflation down and output down. What are you talking about? There's a problem with theory. Doesn't that look just like what central bankers think? No. Let's look closer. So on the left is, again, that's the standard model. And again, now I've taught you to read the graphs and to be skeptical. Wait, interest rates higher than inflation. That means interest costs on the debt went up. That's big, by the way. 100% debt to GDP, 1% interest rate is 1% of GDP more deficit. Who paid the interest costs on the debt there? Aha, let's look at footnote 4, which in this model says, oh, by the way, Congress enacts lump sum taxes to pay the higher interest costs on the debt. Oh, wait a minute, you didn't tell me that. This isn't just the central bank moving. This is the central bank and fiscal policy moving, and the fiscal policy came up with 1% of GDP, more taxes minus spending. That's a joint fiscal plus monetary shock. The rules are, what can the central bank do alone? The second problem, as illustrated in the somewhat overwhelming right graph, in this theory, there are, in fact, still multiple equilibria. For the same interest rate path, the central bank can jigger all of those different inflation paths, and there's one particular assumption swept into technical appendix B, that the shock is an AR1, whatever that means, that selected the lower equilibrium. But in fact, all the other are possibles. And the one marked 0.4, that's the one where there is no fiscal change, and that one you can see inflation goes up. Technical fans, there's the analytic solution to this model. Inflation is a moving average of interest rates plus a shock. The moving average has positive coefficients. In the New Keynesian model, higher interest rates raise inflation, except if there's some sort of equilibrium selection shock. So, like I said before, central banks, the only way central banks lower inflation is with some equilibrium selection shock. I'm going to pick up my central banker. Is that what you do? In any case, you can see this does not embody the standard story. People think of the economic model, like everything we do since 1990. The hope was we'd sprinkle Lucas rational expectations holy water on the 1976 edition of the ISLM model and have it all work out. That's what the hope was. That's what the introduction said. That's not what the equation said. Contemporary textbook theory says that central banks lower inflation by an equilibrium selection shock, which also induces a fiscal contraction. We need to do better. Here's the one that I know of that sort of works. Well, I guess I won't skip this one. Not even adaptive expectations works. So this is the old-fashioned model, adaptive expectations, and this looks more familiar. Higher interest rates do make inflation go down in the future. Yeah, this is what everybody thinks happens. But wait a minute, interest rate greater than inflation. Who pays the interest costs on the debt? Footnote 4, taxes went up to pay the interest costs on the debt. And I won't show the equations here, but I've been able to prove in the standard old-fashioned model, it is the central bank alone cannot lower inflation. If central banks, when they raise interest rates, that raises interest costs on the debt, unless the Treasury pays for those interest costs on the debt, higher interest rates make inflation go up. That's the key hidden assumption. How do higher interest rates make inflation go down? Because we also think the Treasury tightens fiscal policy. This is the best I can do. It's the same graph I showed you before, but it's still of limited application, and it does not embody the same intuition. So challenge one, how can we get inflation to go down at all? This is the best I've been able to do. I hope we'll be able to do better, but you can see there's progress. A little ingredient got inflation to go down for a while. Maybe that's what's after. Maybe some other ingredients will do. We're making progress. We're not there. But the next puzzle, how do we get inflation to go down in the future? Here, I've got inflation jumping down and then going up. How do we get inflation to go down in the future? Back to work. Bring out the calculator. This one only took me a year. We need a simple ingredient where higher interest rates lower inflation going forward. There's the policy belief. There's the models. Higher interest rates raise inflation. Maybe you can have some equilibrium selection shock to make inflation jump down, but then inflation goes up going forward. We want inflation to go down going forward. How do we get there? And this is, I'm always excited to bring you hot off the presses. This is literally hot off the presses. I put up the working paper a month ago, but that's why I'm so excited about it. You can see how we do economics, the progress here. Now, this wrong sign, higher interest rates raising future inflation rather than lowering future inflation, that is deep, deep in the standard model. And it illustrates this chasm I mentioned between the policy beliefs and economic theory, all economics theory since 1990. Higher interest rates, higher real interest rates, raise consumption growth in standard economics. Why? This is very simple. You face a higher real interest rate, what do? You don't go out to dinner tonight, you save the money, you invest it at the higher real rate of return, and then you can go out to 2 dinners 3 years from now. So higher real interest rate lowers current consumption relative to future consumption. Higher real interest rate raises consumption growth. If you've been in the first week of a macro class, you see R equals delta plus gamma G, which says higher interest rate raises consumption growth. Duh. But walk into a central bank and say, higher interest rate, if you raise the real interest rate, that will raise consumption growth in the future. And I'll say, excuse me, son, did you get the sign wrong or did you leave your wits out the front door? Because that's not the policy belief, is higher real interest rates lower consumption growth going in the future. Same with the second ingredient in the model. The Phillips curve says that inflation is high when output is high, but inflation relative to future inflation. Well, output high, meaning inflation high relative to future inflation, means output high when inflation is going down. Walk into a central bank and say, oh, we're having an output boom. That means inflation should be going down in the future. And again, they will say, son, did you have the wrong sign or did you leave your wits at the door? This is a chasm between the two basic equations of our standard model and how we think about things. So we got to fix. And today, I'm humble. I want to fix theory, not empirical work. So I've spent some time. The adaptive model has last inflation in the expectations. The rational model puts future inflation in the expectations. Bob Lucas in 1972 had a lovely model where unexpected today's inflation is what drives the Phillips curve. Maybe we can get a little bit back from the rational stuff towards the irrational stuff without making people irrational. So that's what I did. Output, let's think about output is the surprise. Output is high when inflation is high relative to what people expected in the past. And that sort of works. It produces, now remember, the problem was instability in the old model, stability in the new model. Well, what it produces is dynamics that are unstable in the short run. Maybe I'll do the graph. Unstable in the short run, and then turn around and become stable in the long run. So you have sort of what people believed in the horizon where they see it, but then turns around and becomes neutral in the long run. And by the way, when Milton Friedman and Karl Brunner said money growth is neutral in the long run, everybody said, what are you talking about? That was a crazy idea in the 1960s. Well, this is the same crazy idea. The last one we've gotten used to, I hope we'll get used to this one. So here's the actual model. So same kind of plot. What happens if the blue line, the central bank raises interest rates, in this case with no help from fiscal policy? What happens is instead of a jump down and coming up, we see inflation starting to go down, but then turns around in the long run, goes up. So we're starting to produce something like the results of standard beliefs. The mechanics of this model have nothing to do with the mechanics of standard beliefs. It is not higher interest rates produce lower aggregate demand, produce Phillips curve. But it looks like standard beliefs. And maybe that's where theory, modern theory and policy belief can come together. But of course, it gives very different implications for what will happen in the future. Here's what we definitely do not know about monetary policy. You can see we're at the point of finally making undergraduate textbook two equations that sort of looks like how we think it ought to look like. The ECB put up this lovely chart about how monetary policy works. This is the transmission mechanism. I can assure you we have no scientific understanding of all these charts and arrows, least of all technocratic ability to move all these levers in the direction that we see. There's an illusion of technocratic huge knowledge that we need to be aware of and stick to basics. I want to speak briefly about the euro, also to advertise another book, because we have another book on the fiscal foundations of inflation. And the euro was set up understanding the fiscal foundations of inflation. A currency union without fiscal and political union is completely possible. The key is countries must default, just like companies at some point. Countries, you don't have to leave the euro for a company to default. Eventually, countries have to be the same way. Otherwise, there's this temptation, borrow too much money that you can't repay, yell crisis, call up the ECB and say, bail us out, and you can see where that leads. That leads to uncontrolled inflation. The people who set up the euro understood this and set up a beautiful structure with just one or two missing bits. The beautiful structure is an independent central bank, only price level is a mandate, don't buy government debt, and debt and deficit limits to keep countries, try to force countries to pay back their debts. Remember, paying back your debts, that's the key to no inflation. The few missing bits was no one could quite say out loud that countries will eventually default. And so sovereign debt is treated as risk-free on bank balance sheets. So banks are now a hostage. If a company defaults, nobody goes bankrupt. If a country defaults and everyone's holding risk-free debt on their balance sheets, the financial system goes down. So that was a good system, but unfortunately, in the crises, one after another, those limits got breached. Understandably, you do what you have to do in a crisis. But the moral hazard problem did not get fixed in between, and we have a bunch of reforms to bring the euro back to its original version. We're a very pro-euro book, but you need to fix that underlying fiscal problem that was pretty well done in the beginning, but has kind of fallen apart. So let me speak briefly about the future. With a fiscal in mind, this is the projection of the US debt to GDP ratio. That's our projected surpluses. Switzerland looks much better. The rest of Europe looks about this bad. So the whole world faces this sovereign debt question. And even that's optimistic because, of course, crises will come and debts will rise in a crisis. What we all know is this will not happen. The only question is, how will this not happen? Now, I think it's important to think about specific scenarios. Why do I worry? Well, one worry, remember what we just said, in all current models, central banks cannot durably lower inflation by higher interest rates unless fiscal policy tightens to pay the interest costs on the debt. We right now in the US are having a big fight about whether the Fed will lower interest rates precisely to lower interest costs on the debt. That is going to be a hard issue for central banks to face. Another question is, when the next crisis comes, and Uncle Sam says, uh-oh, crisis, I need stimulus, I need bailout, I need a military, who's going to lend $10 trillion anticipating that they're going to get paid back? The answer is we need to fix that long-run fiscal problem, and that's the only way to avoid huge tensions as they come. The best solution, of course, is growth. So that's the thing I want to end with. It's what I'm going to talk about at dinner. I talk about inflation and debt and stuff because I have some professional expertise about it. Growth is the most important problem. And they tie together because the best way to get tax revenue is tax rate times income. Raising tax rate, that's hard. It hurts your economy. Raising income, you can raise more revenue at the same tax rate. Wouldn't that be nice? More growth solves all problems. But growth is the central question. So let me just point out the issue. Here is the United States along with most of Europe, China, and India. Notice the vast disparities in growth, which we'll talk about. The US used to grow smartly, and then about 2000 fell off the trend. So growth, the long-run growth rate in the US has gone down by 1/2 to 2/3 off of what it was before. So the growth and the difference between where we are and where we should be is just a chasm. That's like $20,000, $30,000. This is a closer version of the US, including Switzerland, the Eurozone. I try to be a little bit polite to my hosts, especially when they're doing such a great job. But notice, even though Switzerland's above the US may be having a growth slowdown. Switzerland's growth is even slower than the US, and the rest of Europe is a disaster. Now, by disaster, I mean, well, look, we're catching up to the US, then around 2010, growth, GDP per capita, basically stops. Sorry, this is only my second favorite country. Italy is my favorite. And the tragedy, povera Italia, is that growth went down. Italy has now less GDP per capita than it had in 2010. What went wrong? Especially, the tragedy is, I love the EU, I love the euro, but this was supposed to ignite an enormous spurt of growth. You have now a continent-wide free market. Why did you not get to the US and pass it? The US is dysfunctional. Everybody knows that. Europe should be able to just surge past the US. So growth, and that is, I spent time on inflation and debt because I know something about it. But growth is the long-run issue. Growth will be the central thing to do to stop debt and inflation issues, and that is the one we need to talk about, as well as stable institutions, good central banks, good fiscal institutions. That's a backdrop for growth, but that's not the only ingredient. So where we are, we finally have a simple, coherent economic theory of inflation. It has all the good properties. We get some reasonable dynamics. Simple explanation of the episodes, survives the recent experiments, overturns many classic doctrines. Passive money, real bills are okay. Inside money doesn't matter. Interest rate pegs can be okay. Market interest on ample reserves is a wonderful thing. We don't have to go back to small reserves. Where we need to go is, how do central banks lower inflation by raising interest rates? We made a lot of progress that you see, but there's a good place to go. It's only 1905, and we got 1920s and 1930s to go on reconstructing monetary excitement, which makes it a very exciting moment to be. And of course, it opens the door to deeper questions. How should central banks be structured? Should countries issue indexed foreign long debt? Are there better policy rules to nominal rates? What do you do about it? We have to face that central banks cannot fully control inflation. That was something we hoped for in the 1970s. Fiscal rules for price stability. Fiscal policy is just as important as monetary policy. We need to pay more attention to that. I think debt rules are just a spectacular way of convincing people that expected repayment will always be out there, and therefore insuring yourself against inflation. The end. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, John, for this interesting perspective on
lightning
inflation.
tour.
We're moving to the Q&A part now. We'll give you 2-3 minutes to think about your questions, and I'll go ahead with mine. You already give a bit of an outlook on the future. I want to look into the future because recently we've seen President Trump signing the big, beautiful bill into law, while at the same time the US government is also pressuring the Fed to loosen monetary policy, alongside raising tariffs that are also fragmenting global economy. So what do you think, looking ahead, what does all of that mean for price levels in the long run, maybe 10 years or so?
Oh, well, I've learned never to forecast the future even next week, especially with Mr. Trump in charge. Forecasting 10 years out, well, the one good thing about it is you can't hold me to account because you will have forgotten what I said 10 years from now. I think that the fiscal situation is not it leads to fragility more than an instant crisis. And the fragility is if we need to borrow a lot of money to fight a new war or a new crisis, it's going to be hard to do it. It's going to be harder to respond to shocks with that level of debt. Debt is not really the center of the crisis, though, of the problem. If the US defaulted on all its debt today, wiped it out, inflated it away, we still want to borrow 3 to 5% of GDP. So I'm going to default on all my debt. Oh, now tomorrow I'm going to, hey, would you lend me 3 to 5% of GDP to cover my social insurance coverage? It's going to be worse, right? The problem is the repayment. And I think I've said it 5 times, I'll say it again. You can pay off a lot of debt, but you need good institutional structures where people are confident you're going to repay it. That's the central problem. As far as BBB was, it's a lot of fuss, but it really was business as usual. We fought about 38% versus 39%. Reagan cut the top marginal rate from 70 to 28 and broadened the base so much that they made money on it. So we're not even in this territory fighting about the BBB. It's just not significant on the long run issue, good or bad. It doesn't really face our entitlement question, Europe's entitlement question, everyone's entitlement question. It doesn't really face it. Tariffs. Now you're asking kind of like the broader evaluation here. Tariffs are, of course, the U.S. is shooting ourselves in the foot with tariffs and shooting our neighbors in the foot while we're at it. And I think in some sense, beyond the economic damage, if China invades Taiwan and we want to call up the world and say, hey, we need your help on this, the world's going to say, oh, yeah, that's nice. So I really believe in being nice to your friends and neighbors and allies. Economically, it is damaging, but we have to admit it's not a huge damage. Tariffs are better than quotas. And there's a lot of good stuff going on in the Trump administration. You got to say one thing for Trump. We're not just sitting with business as usual, doing nothing. Everything is in ferment, and much of it good. We're not going to regulate AI to death. That was in the cards, not going to happen. We're not going to regulate energy to death. That was in the cards. It's not going to happen. So there's a big deregulation effort going on under the screen. So this is all supply side, and there's headwinds and there's tailwinds, and so we shall see. That's my forecast. I got to say one last thing. Sorry, I'm going on too long, but I am a proud American, and it is true that Americans will always do the right thing after we've tried everything else. It is true we have a pretty good, though fraying, constitutional structure with checks and balances. We'll see if these tariffs survive legal review. We'll see if they survive Congress waking up and say, wait a minute, taxes, that's our job. So there are forces that can accept the good things and hopefully get rid of the bad things as long as we stay intact, which so far we are.
Great. We shall see then. I'm going to turn to you now for your questions. You have a microphone on your side. You can click on it, press the button, and then it will turn on. But I will, I will start here with our host, Martin.
Thank you very much. This was very fascinating, very interesting. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on the role of these debt break rules that you also have in Switzerland. So what makes them credible and what makes them durable? Because they are also like setups that have to be durable to be credible.
So the role of I didn't have to catch
the debt break rules, these debt rules. I think they are really central to your theory. Thank you.
Yeah, all rules, rules are meant to be broken. The word goes. Germany had a nice debt break, and then they said, well, we need to have defense spending, but we don't feel like cutting our social programs. Oh, well, so much for the debt break rule. And I think rules are also useful if everybody recognizes it. It becomes a norm in an institution. I mean, why did the U.S. pay back its debt so often? The U.S. has been able to borrow money. There's no debt break rule that says we have to pay it back rather than inflate it, but people trusted us. Ever since Alexander Hamilton, we developed a reputation, and people felt, no, this is our holy duty is to pay back our bondholders, and that worked even without a formal rule. So I think what you have is a formal rule backed up by a civic understanding that that's the way we do things, and I think that's what leads to faith in the institutions. I didn't really say, somebody else may want, what do you mean expectations? You think Joe and Jane sit down at the dinner table and say, honey, I see that the forecast budget deficit in the year 2045 is minus 5% of GDP. Do we really want to hold those government bonds? No, that's not how it works. People have a faith in the institutions that eventually these politicians will figure out a way to pay it off without inflating it. And that's the faith that is enhanced by debt rules, by constitutional limits, but also enhanced by people saying this is how we behave and obeying it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, here. Yeah.
Very good. Now, central banks, they recognize that some people are heavily indebted and they have mortgages. Here, everybody's the same. There are no mortgages. There is no impact on consumer spending from raising interest rates. So I wonder what happens if you have private debt in this world. And secondly, Japan. Why hasn't Japan had a massive inflation? They have public debt is just extraordinary.
This is great. Now, there is an interest rate on spending effect in what I showed you. It's very simple. It's the one we described. If interest rates are higher, people don't go out to dinner tonight. They save, and then they go out to dinner later. So that is an effect, and you're going, ha, ha, ha. That's right. It's a very simple model, but one we don't think is realistic. And so we're slightly more, now let's add some more important things, and you're exactly right. Interest rates and how they affect mortgages, which also, different countries have different rules, which should make a dramatic difference. In the US, people have fixed rate mortgages. So they say, interest rates up, what do I care? I mean, the construction industry, new mortgages care. In much of the rest of the world, mortgages are variable rates. So you raise interest rates and everybody is faced with more interest payments. So I think that's exactly right, but one model at a time. I think that's exactly where we need to go to understand better how monetary policy is. The what about Japan question, you might guess I've heard this one before. So this is a question of debt sustainability, and it's not really a fiscal theory question, even if you don't believe in fiscal theory. Well, why are people holding Japanese government bonds at 160% net to GDP? So I have 10 bullet points. I'll only give you a few. One of them, of course, is if Japan is special, that doesn't mean Argentina is special. So every other country that has tried it doesn't get to go to 160%. Well, I guess Italy touches there, but Italy's got the ECB and Germany helping out. But everyone, UK around 100% started having troubles. US around 100% starts having troubles. Argentina at 40%. So we'll be like Japan. No, debt crisis at 40%. Now, part of what makes Japan special is its debt is held by old Japanese people. It's long-term debt held by old Japanese people. US government debt is short-term debt held by foreign central banks and hedge funds. Good luck. That's much, hotter money. The other part of Japan, and I think this is the warning for all of us, all debt is sustainable if interest rates are low. especially if they're negative. Because countries go bankrupt the way companies go bankrupt. We all have our present values and our accountants and our solvency conditions. No. You go bankrupt when you open the shoebox to pay the bill and there's no money in there, right? That's when you go bankrupt. Countries also, they go bankrupt when they can't roll over the debt. They can't make the interest payments. So at low interest rates, that's very sustainable. At high interest rates, all of a sudden crisis. That's what happened to Greece. They suddenly couldn't roll over at the higher interest rates. So Japan is just as fragile as the rest of us. So my final answer is just wait.
Thank you very much. Then here, yeah, gentlemen.
Hi.
Yeah.
So you spend a lot of time on the positive aspects of your theory, but what about the normative? Like, does adding your new ingredients change some of the normative conclusions of the models? And as a follow-up question, there's been some renewed debate about the idea of having a range instead of a target for inflation. Does your former answer, does it change something on this dimension as well, since it's a topic?
Oh boy, why am I getting such great questions? So normative, I think I actually have stuck in a lot of normative. I don't like inflation. I have German ancestors, and maybe that's stuck with me. Lots of economists say, oh, just raise the inflation target. Who cares about inflation? I don't like inflation at all. So you can see a lot of normative that I put in there. We need a policy regime, a joint fiscal and monetary policy committed to low inflation, and that involves institutions that force fiscal policy when they borrow money to pledge to pay it back, which includes commitment to low marginal tax rates and high economic growth, as well as commitment to spending reasonably. I think I've, in some sense, gone over the edge onto normative. Although there is in there, how should you run policy? But unless you have a normative fight with me, I'll leave that alone. Yeah, range not target is also a question. I gather Switzerland has a range, 0 to 2. US says 2%. I think central banks went nuts when inflation came out 1.7%. And what you should have done with 1.7% inflation for a decade is raise the mission accomplished flag and say, we will be in Aruba having drinks. Call us when you need there's a problem. You're 0.3%. I mean, inflation is measured to within 1% accuracy at best, and it bats up and down all the time because of various temporary factors. So to tie yourself too tightly, I think, was a mistake. Now, personally, I think we should go back to a price level target. So I think the big policy question with the inflation target, the US and the ECB say 2%, and they made this up on their own, by the way. The mandate was just price stability. So they said, what does price stability mean? Well, we think it means 2%, not 0, on a forward-looking basis, which means if we screw up, oh, well, so what? So long as the forecast says back to 2%, we've achieved our mandate. So I think it would be much better to say we want a price level mandate, 0 inflation, and if it goes down, we'll come back up again. If it goes up, we'll come back down again. That is what gives the kind of confidence in monetary institutions that underlies great growth. But I think I'm a complete heretic on that topic.
Yes.
Hi, Jean-Paul Lullier from Brandeis University. So it's a nice theory to make sense of the path of debt and inflation after COVID. But there's a little problem, which goes in the same direction of the Japan question, which is if you look at the 15 years in the US before, you got the completely wrong prediction because inflation was flat. Now, you're going to probably tell me the difference is that the debt after COVID was monetized and not before. But then, when QE is in a way monetized, and you can tell me, of course, central banks were going to reverse it when the economy recovers. But if you look at if the total balance sheet of Federal Reserve banks being 6 times what it was before the great financial crisis 15 years later, I mean, are you really going to bank the prediction that is just because people thought it was going to reverse before on the notion that that's their belief? And so then, even 15 years later, they're still thinking that there's going to be reverse, and that's why we didn't have inflation before? How do you think about it?
This is wonderful. And by the way, I'm from the University of Chicago, so if people don't challenge you, I feel like you've bored them. So thank you for challenging questions. I think, in fact, the problem that so my book on the fiscal theory is 600 pages of trying to apply this to the world. And the problem I faced is the opposite. If only there was some easy, clear prediction that you can say is falsified. But it's very much like the theory of finance. Finance is stock price is expected present value of dividends, discounted at some appropriate rate. And we've been fighting about that for 50 years. It's the same theory, and the problem is there's too many degrees of freedom. I can explain anything because I've got the observed price, but then I've got the expected future surpluses. Well, what do people think about fiscal policy for the next 50 years? You can make anything up you want. And then if you tie that down, then you got the problem with what rate do you discount that at? And changing, anybody who's done any finance, changing the discount rate, you can come up with any number you want. So in fact, the problem has been the opposite one of trying to come up with some testable content one way or the other, which is, the theory of finance faces the same problems. They've been actually very successful for 50 years despite those problems, and I think the same approach helps. Now, your particular one, the 2010s versus COVID, I would say it's the opposite, that the QE, I think, really basically had no effect in either case, one way or the other. Because QE is I take your $20 bills and I give you 2 5s and a 10. Who cares? And so the monetization, while a little bit shocking, since they gave interest-paying reserves in return, I don't think that actually made that much difference. Had the Treasury adopt $5 trillion of 1 week interest-paying debt with no plans to pay it back, I think we would have gotten the same inflation. The key difference is, I think, is not about the QE. It's in the COVID time, there was no credible plan to paying back the debt. Whereas at least in 2008, they had the decency to say, deficit now, debt repayment later. Now, I made fun of them. Oh yeah, debt repayment 1 day after this administration leaves office. Yeah, thanks, guys. But they had the decency to say it. No one had the decency to even say that this time. It was all, oh, don't worry about government debt. And the second one, which is, I didn't really highlight it, but the discount rate, the interest costs matter enormously. So after 2008, real interest rates on US debt went to negative values for a decade. So like Japan, that really helps to get people to say, oh, this debt's fine because, the discount rate is negative. In fact, that's how we got into the whole R less than G morass of people thinking, in fact, the puzzle is we don't have infinite deflation because government debt's worth an infinite amount. So low interest rates on the debt, and I don't think we'll see that in the future. I don't think we're going back to negative real interest rates. So I emphasize that the distinction between 2008, at least in my mind, and COVID, is the credibility of the repayment, not the QE or no QE, and whether we think governments will get to finance debt at incredibly low interest rates for a generation, which I don't think we have anymore.
Thank you so much. Yeah, gentleman over there.
Question specifically about the independence of the Federal Reserve. So you mentioned earlier about some of the good things that the Trump administration is doing, such as not regulating AI to death, not regulating energy. Do you think also it would be beneficial in the long run, because this is something that I'm confident Trump would be on board with, which is for the Federal Reserve to lose its independence and become an agency that is under direct presidential authority? Do you think that would be something that would be beneficial for the economy as a whole, whether it's managing inflation or, as you mentioned, like promoting growth and long-term growth as policies change and as you try to handle crises as they come up by having this more unified structure for managing economic problems?
Thank you for asking that question. So I get to say on the record, no. I think Fed independence is very important. I was one of the co-signers of the amicus brief that went to the Supreme Court saying, don't do this, Fed independence is very important. Now, it is not true that the right structure is for central banks to be completely independent technocrats who may go off and print money and do as they wish with it, because that would lead to a central banker, one might decide, well, the climate crisis is the most important thing in the world. I'm going to print money and buy windmills. Or another central banker might decide, oh no, we need to reshore American manufacturing. I'm going to print money and hand it out to manufacturing plants. We don't want that, right? So independence must be balanced by a limited mandate and by sticking. The mandate for us, inflation and employment, means and nothing else. Now, there's been a lot of criticism, I think, and some of it right, of the Fed of going past its mandate. The Fed has been too political, even with its current independence. I don't think the answer is to make it even more political, keep its huge power, and lets us use that tool in ways we want, or us or you, depending on whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So I think we need to keep independence, but to the extent there are valid criticisms of the Fed going past its mandate, we need to reinforce the mandate and go back to a limited central bank that does things that a central bank can do in a fairly apolitical manner and not intrude into fiscal policy, not intrude too much into telling banks where to lend and so forth. There is a problem, and the answer is not to take over the central bank and make it more discretionary, but instead to restore its independence within restored limits.
Thank you very much. Then here, yeah, gentlemen, yeah. You have a microphone on your side, on your other side, yeah. And then you click, you have to press.
So thank you very much. I have two questions. One relates to the one just previously. Basically, in the 1970s, you know, financial repression brought US debt down quite a lot because of the high inflation. What can I learn from your model about financial repression? And how likely do you think it is going to happen again, given that it seems to be the path of least resistance for many countries, including this Fed discussion that we just had? The second question I was wondering about, if you look at your model, it seems to me that the inflation response is just a function of the intertemporal budget constraint, right? So in some sense, I mean, that's the fiscal theory of the price level. In some sense, I'm wondering whether there are equally likely other plausible fiscal policy reaction functions that don't quite give you that result.
Okay, let me start with a question I know how to answer, and then I'll think about the one that I have trouble with. So what do governments do when they face strong fiscal pressures and they don't feel like raising tax revenue or lowering spending? Sometimes because they're in the middle of the war, and you know, lowering. If you're fighting World War II, you know, you got to do what you got to do. Well, the standard litany of you raise taxes as much as possible. Financial repression is next. You hold down interest costs on the debt. And moreover, you force banks to hold debt. You pass rules saying, corporations, you all need to hold debt. You pass capital controls, keep people from pushing debt out of the country. And then you move on to wealth taxes. You grab, the most tempting tax of all is to grab all of wealth unexpectedly and then promise never to do it again. So you do that. And don't do it too often, because otherwise people don't, pass a one-time huge wealth tax. Try to make it one time so people will still invest. Then you pass wage and price controls and hopefully win the war before the economy falls apart or you become the Soviet Union or whatever it is. So I hope that is not likely. That is where you go if you don't solve a fiscal problem. This is just standard fiscal policy, not fiscal theory at the price level. Because we do not face a huge magnitude external threat. I mean, in the US, no one's invading us. They're not even invading Canada. They're invading Ukraine, but this isn't yet something that really challenges Europe's financial stability. You're paying 50 to 60% on welfare programs, so 3% for defense is like couch change. So none of us in the Western world are facing a fiscal crisis. It's simply our inability to make our social programs work, especially with a demographic plunge on the way. Surely we can all do the right thing after we've tried everything else and pass the simple, straightforward reforms that would avoid us having to go down the war finance spectrum, starting with financial repression and exorbitant capital taxation. You asked something about alternative debt rules that I didn't really understand, so maybe I'll get you to explain what they are after the fact.
You can, yeah, great. Well, yeah, maybe one more, yeah?
John, thank you very much for not the speech, but very interesting, fact-based. I would like to ask you, why does our Swiss National Bank have to buy dollars to support your authorities or to support the Europeans? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the target of that question. But we just had a fascinating discussion. Really small countries have to have pegged exchange rates. Really big countries just worry about interest rates and don't worry about exchange rates. You're kind of in the intermediate range where you got to worry about interest rates, inflation, and exchange rates. I won't presume to have better advice on how to manage the fact that if the exchange rate goes down, you're going to import inflation, and that's something the Fed doesn't. So you have to worry about the exchange rate in ways that we don't. I'll just close with praise for Swiss monetary policy in the form of a joke. The last time I was here, the issue was that the Swiss franc was going so high, and it was when the attempt to hold it down fell apart. And I don't think any other country in the world has been so thrifty that its attempt at an exchange rate peg failed in the upward direction. Because we refused to print money and send it out and have you guys send us Porsches. No, that would not be the Swiss way of doing things. Every other country goes in the opposite direction. I think you're doing pretty well when that's your problem.
John, maybe to finish up, while the Q&A is now closed, the public one, while I was reading about you, I also found your wife's webpage, Elizabeth Fama, and her last name rang a bell, of course. Her father is the famous economist Eugene Fama, who received the Nobel Prize in 2013. So if we apply his efficient market hypothesis to family ties, would you describe your relationship with your father-in-law as weak, semi-strong, or strong?
Very strong. Gene Fama has been an inspiration for me personally as well as professionally. For 30 years, my office was next to him. I came to Chicago as a young assistant professor. What was great about Chicago was Gene Fama, Bob Lucas, Lars Hansen. Their doors were open. I would just wander in and ask stupid questions. They would interrupt what we were doing. They would talk to me. That's how I learned where I am. Gene and the others are a model of professional ethics. It's always about what's right, not who did you cite, what club were you on, and so forth. And Gene was of course, my professional companion for those 30 years. We were also we would work offices next to each other in the morning. Then in the afternoon, we'd go windsurfing together. So he was my buddy, and then we would often have family dinners together, which were a great pleasure. So just a model of a wonderful person and a superb academic.
And maybe just quick on the family dinners, because I also saw that your children and your wife, they're in the creative fields, so they're musicians and artists. Your wife, an adult book writer. I mean, she also studied economics. So what do you talk about at family dinners?
So I'm allowed to do some nepotism, yes. Look up Elizabeth Fama's wonderful books. Sally Fama Cochrane's excellent paintings. Gene Cochrane and Lake Fama, who are very creative musician, animator, and so forth. So I'm blessed to have a creative family. I am terrible at all artistic elements. Sometimes I play the guitar and everyone tells me to put it away and write some equations down. Something more serious. But all my family are just very interesting people, very interested in economics. I'll just tell one story. My daughter, Sally, who is now a great artist, we were discussing fuel economy standards. She was 8, and she looked up and said, "Dad, if they pass that everybody has to have more efficient cars, won't they just move farther away from work and burn the same amount of gas anyway?" And I just gave her a hug. It's in the genes. But comparative advantage, she's an even better artist than she would have been an economist, so I'm glad she's doing it.
Well, thank you very much, John. It was a pleasure having you here in Zurich, hearing you speak. So please put your hands together for John Cochrane.